Hello, my friends. I'm going to tell you an absolutely extraordinary story today, and because of the pilot's personality, as you'll see, much of its mystery will remain. It's February 3rd, 2019. It's a Sunday, and it's about 1:45 p.m. The neighborhood is Yorba Linda, which is where American President Richard Nixon was born. And it's raining nonstop. It's pouring, it's cold, it's windy, the weather is bad. People are staying home because of the weather, but also for another reason. It's because in Atlanta at the Mercedes-Benz Stadium, it's the Super Bowl. All of America is watching, and Californians even more so because one of the teams is from California and they're going to lose the Super Bowl. By the way, then suddenly here's what's going to happen. Suddenly we hear a noise, an engine noise that gets louder and louder, engines roaring. And then suddenly, from beneath the clouds, a plane appears diving at almost a 60-degree angle. And then in an instant, it catches fire, starts to break apart, and then it crashed into the houses. Several houses were hit and caught fire. So, what happened? A few minutes earlier, about 10 minutes earlier, we were at Fullerton Airport. We have a Cessna 414 that's about to take off. It's a plane that's going to depart without a flight plan, VFR. You can see the view. There's usually no obligation to file a flight plan. So the pilot checks in on the frequency and the FAA controller communicates with him. But before he takes off, she tells him, be careful to the east of the airfield. The weather is terrible, so be careful. The pilot, to his credit, is extremely polite with the lady, thanks her and all that. And then he takes off. He was supposed to go to Minden, 600 kilometers away in Nevada. But before that, he still had to get through this extremely cloudy area with severe turbulence. There was even an airmet that had been issued for vertically developing clouds, so it was a pretty scary region. In reality, the VFR conditions were marginal. This gentleman, let's take a closer look at his personality because it will be at the heart of this case. He is 75 years old. He goes by the name Antonio. The problem is, Mr. Antonio has several identities. There are at least 3 different names under which he is known or has been known at different times in his life. In 2001, when he got divorced, his wife told the judge he had multiple personalities, multiple identities. And then under each identity, he has a social security number and bank accounts. He himself said that because he had opened restaurants, he was part of the nightlife scene and all that. He had opened sushi restaurants that were frequented by the police. And he said that he was a retired Chicago police officer. By the way, he had a police badge. He would show it quite willingly. He never parted with it. In fact, it was found on his body after the accident. And you should know that the California police, at first, when they arrived to brief the media and the public to explain what happened, they introduced the pilot as a former cop from the Chicago area. And that's what made the Chicago police look into their records, and they couldn't find anyone with that name, that description, or anything else. And the badge that was found on the body was a badge that had been lost, reported lost in 1978, and he always kept it on him. He must have gotten it off the back of a truck, that's it. Antonio, who was known, as I said, under various identities, well, had been at the time, up until literally his death, in the circle of a certain Danny Hoff. Danny Hoff is a figure in Nevada's Underworld, a politician as well. He was the head of the Nevada Brothel Owners Association. And then he considered Antonio as his personal pilot. And Antonio would fly girls for him because Mr. Danny Hoff owned a lot of brothels in Nevada. And what happened is that this Danny Hoff, well, towards the end of his life, he was also involved in politics with the Republican Party. And when he died, by the way, he died in a brothel of a heart attack. When he passed away, The people who liked him a lot actually made sure he was elected. They voted for him posthumously. And when you look at his Wikipedia page or elsewhere today, you'll see that he was elected, but since he had died, he never took office. He never served his term. So we have a person who is we have a troubled character. There are about 20 years in his life where we don't know what he did. Why? Because during those 20 years when he claimed he was a police detective in Chicago, we know he wasn't. So there are 20 years missing from his biography. Was he in prison? Was he working for the government? Was he doing something else? We don't know. In any case, in terms of aviation, he has 10,000 flight hours, which is quite impressive because usually you won't find people who can afford to get 10,000 flight hours. 10,000 flight hours is what an airline pilot who literally works Monday to Friday for an airline would have. That's what they do. Well, it depends. 10, 12, 15 years, depending on how often they fly. But just to tell you, 10,000 flight hours is pretty rare to find among private pilots who fly under Part 91. From an aeronautical standpoint as well, he's someone who has been expelled at least twice by the INFA. That means his license had been revoked because once he flew with a plane that hadn't had the required maintenance and whose paperwork had been expired for a long time. It's a temporary registration that normally lasts 120 days, but he never renewed it. He flew much longer than that. Another time, his license was also revoked or suspended for a long period for 6 months because he lied to an air traffic controller. He had come back. At that time, he didn't have the training to fly IFR. That means flying by instruments. And then what he did was he lied to an air traffic controller to get instrument clearance. And usually after that, it goes smoothly. Up until now, people who lie and say they're IFR qualified, they're not. It goes through. Air traffic controllers or others aren't going to check that kind of claim. But in his case, he wasn't lucky and he got caught for it. And the AFA suspended his license. So, like I'm telling you, he's a strange person. He's someone with a troubled personality who doesn't respect any laws. Now, there's a problem. If you ignore the law, you can get away with it. You pay, you get a good lawyer, you get off with a suspended sentence, the judge is nice. But with physics, you don't have any of that. Unfortunately, the laws of physics don't forgive. So what he's going to do is take off. I said, turn left, go east. The aircraft is a twin-engine propeller plane powered by 2 Continental 6-cylinder engines. A very powerful, capable aircraft, especially with him flying solo. But he's going to enter the clouds and start experiencing he probably ran into a cumulonimbus. That means it's a cloud with vertical development. And when a plane, especially one of that size, goes through it, it's like being in a washing machine on the spin cycle. That means the plane is completely out of control. So at first, it's the autopilot that's handling things. At some point, the autopilot gives up and disconnects. All autopilots in the world are programmed like that. If it can no longer control the aircraft, there are internal controls that make it say, okay, I'm letting go. If the autopilot sees that it's turning the ailerons to the left, but the plane isn't going left and keeps going right and so on, at that point, there's a feedback loop that indicates there's a problem and everything gets shut off. And so he ends up controlling it himself. As the NTSB described the movements of the plane, we realized that there's something going on beyond just what the pilot did. Because for the NTSB, he was disoriented. He was in severe turbulence. It started shaking. He acted on the controls. He had no visibility. And then he ended up completely disoriented. What the NTSB said is probably true. Now I'm going to go a step further than they did. Why? Because according to a recorder on board, we can see that during the last 15 seconds of this plane, it lost 5,000 feet. That's about 20,000 feet per minute. That's huge. Usually planes in distress, out of control, generally have a descent rate of 10,000 feet per minute. You don't get much more than that. Here we have twice as much. That's huge. Another thing, if we look at the behavior of the aircraft, at times it reached 75 degrees, nose up, so literally it's flying almost vertically. Then at a 45-degree dive, during that same time, the bank angle went from 170 degrees on one side to 150 degrees on the other. That means we're seeing that for 15 seconds, this aircraft is making movements that, in my opinion, aren't aerodynamically possible. That means we don't have a Cap 10 here, we don't have a Z-lane, we don't have an aerobatic aircraft. Yes, with an aerobatic aircraft, pilots just do this, then they spin the aircraft around. That's not a problem. These are planes designed to have this intrinsic instability, this natural instability that makes the controls extremely aggressive. So with an aerobatic plane, we wouldn't be surprised to hear such numbers. Now, on a transport plane like a Cessna 414, which are built to be stable, it's not possible just by using the controls alone to get that kind of performance. To roll inverted one way, then a few seconds later the other way, to pitch up to 75 degrees, then dive down at 45. That's not something that seems possible without the intervention of external forces. The external forces are precisely the meteorological forces. That's exactly what happened. The aircraft must have encountered updrafts, then downdrafts and severe turbulence that shook it. The pilot was fighting to control it. So indeed, it's possible that at some point the pilot acted on the controls trying to get out of the situation, but he might have ended up making things worse for himself. For example, let's say there's a strong gust that pushes the plane to the right, and he corrects by pulling the control stick all the way to the left. And then the next moment, there's a gust that hits the plane and pushes it to the left. And now you can imagine the ailerons are turned all the way to the left, plus the turbulence pushing it to the left as well. At that point, he could flip over because of the combination of two forces, the pilot's force, but also the force of the elements. That's why it's very difficult to correct. Generally, we don't correct much during turbulence. We only correct excessive movements. We don't try to counter each one. Turbulence is too fast. We can't. So, as I was saying, what happens is that the plane starts to lose altitude. It comes out of the clouds, but now it's going too fast. At that point, it has gone beyond all reasonable limits. Some people saw it, including pilots who were on the ground nearby. So what they see is him coming out. The guy who is completely disoriented suddenly comes out of the clouds. And what does he see? He sees the ground. He roughly realizes which direction he's in. What does he do? He starts to pull hard on the control stick to try to recover. Except he overdoes it, because if the speed is too high, well, if you start acting too aggressively with all your strength on the controls, you can break the plane. And that's what's going to happen. So he's going to pull hard on the control stick to try to avoid the ground. By doing that, he's going to break the tail. So pieces of the tail broke off. We know this because there's a paint transfer. That means that sometimes parts get torn off. They can hit other parts before coming off. So if we see parts that are normally separate, that can't touch each other under normal circumstances, and then we see there's a paint transfer, a paint mark from one part on the other, it means that at some point they came into contact. We realize it broke and can begin to understand the dynamics. What also happened is that a wing was torn off, it broke, and then it fell. And since it broke, the fuel inside caught fire and it fell onto a house. Once it fell on the house, there were people inside. There were several people in there who were just relaxing, watching TV, the Super Bowl. The wing broke through the roof of the house and then everything caught fire. So the house went up in flames while we were there. And of course, there were people who died on the ground. So we have 4 people killed on the ground plus 2 people seriously injured. So we have 6 people in total, 6 victims on the ground. The pilot was killed. The plane, the wreckage, the fuselage section, if you will, ended up in the garden of a house. The engines, we found one in the middle of the road, another in a garden. And these are Continental engines, 6 cylinders, very heavy, very dense. If that had fallen on a house, it could have caused more casualties because it goes right through a house when it's thrown at high speed. We have a woman who was at home and then suddenly she hears the windows of her house shattering. And there's a piece of propeller because when one of the propellers hit the ground, it broke. And there's a piece of propeller that went through a bay window, a wall, and ended up stuck in the fridge. It narrowly missed her. So suddenly it's a disaster in that part of the world. People start calling for help, 911, 911. They realize that the operator isn't answering. In fact, the operator isn't answering because it was simply overloaded, because the calls kept coming in non-stop, non-stop. The firefighters, the police, the rescuers were all rushing toward the area, heading back to the area. But when they arrived, they put out fires in houses and everything. Then they realized there was still a lot of damage, a lot of property damage. When you look at the map here, you find an aileron. Here, you find a wheel, a propeller, a piece of propeller, an engine, all of that. So a lot of houses were affected. Plus, of course, the one that was most seriously affected, the one that caught fire and in which, unfortunately, 4 people were found dead. So there you have it, my friends. An accident that happened in 2019, and you realize that people who fly thinking that the laws of physics don't apply to their particular case often, often end up causing damage. And in this case, he was alone in the plane. So, if the plane had crashed somewhere else, okay, there would have been only one victim. But here, he took other people with him who had nothing to do with any of this. These are collateral victims who were living their lives and ended up involved in this nasty story. The man was buried. And to tell you the truth, we still don't really know who he is. Because you see, he goes by too many names, a story, a biography that's mostly made up, so we don't really know. The story ends here. Let me remind you about my book, Lee Titan, which was released recently. It's on Amazon in paperback format. And here too, we have a story where someone thinks that physics doesn't apply to him. It's Stockton Rush who built Titan. This submersible with which he wanted to go to the Titanic. He did 88 dives, not all of them on the Titanic. You should know that at Ocean Gate, whenever they put the submersible vehicle underwater, they counted it as a dive. Even if the dive was going to end after 5 minutes, or it was going to be cancelled or something else, they still counted it as a dive. So the tragedy happened on the 88th dive. And if you look at the previous dives, you realize that he only had problems. Constant problems that kept getting more and more serious. He kept going against all odds, against the laws of physics, until the moment when he ended up crushed, along with Mr. Nargeolet, the Frenchman who was there as a guide. We called him Mr. Titanic, and 3 clients, a man and his son, and then Harding, who is an experienced explorer. To be fair to him, let me tell you something. What I found sad in this story, what hurt me the most was that guy and his son who died in this story, and I'll tell you why. I explain it in the book. It's that when you look at Nargeolet Harding and also Stockton Rush, these 3 guys lived their whole lives on adrenaline. They lived for the rush. They saw all the oceans in the world. They visited many countries. For example, Harding dove into the Mariana Trench, the deepest area in the world. He had already traveled around the world several times. He broke many records. So in a way, they took a calculated risk in their lives. They knew they didn't want to die in their beds. They knew their lives involved risks, but at the same time, it's a rich, exciting life with plenty of stories to tell, with lots of thrills. It's fine. It's a trade-off in a way. On the other hand, those 2 guys who went with them, it's their first time doing something outside their usual lane. You see? It's the first time they're going on an adventure. It's the first time they're trying something a little outside what they usually do, and they end up dead. They died without even seeing the Titanic, you see. They didn't even get that consolation. They only got the fear, the adrenaline, the worry, the creaking sounds. And then, 400 meters before seeing the Titanic, it was over. Here you go, friends. The book is available on Amazon. And see you in the next video. See you very soon.